But for today, we are super pleased to have Dr. Marcelle Trote Martins with us. Welcome, Marcelle.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
We are very happy to have you. Why don't I start with a brief introduction? So, Marcelle is a lecturer in global politics at the University of Manchester, where she also has her PhD from. She has her master's and undergraduate degrees from the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro in international relations. And she does really fantastic work on sort of questions of conflict, violence, and using affect and images to investigate that. Sort of precisely the kind of stuff that many of us here are really, really interested in. And today, in particular, we're here to talk about Marcelle's new book, Affective Imageries, Visual Politics of Wounded Bodies in Timor-Leste. It's a great book. I strongly recommend it. It looks at how images of human rights violations in Timor-Leste were mobilized to gain international attention to promote the struggle for independence. Marcelle focuses in particular on how wounded bodies were mobilized by the resistance movements in an attempt to gain international attention. She looks in particular at two aspects, at how these images and the emotions they engender shaped the effort to call international attention to the issue of self-determination. And then second, she looks at how images more recently played a role in challenging the official narrative of the past. But rather than me rambling on, we want to hear from Marcelle. And maybe if you could perhaps start off, Marcelle, and just tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this topic. Why Timor-Leste? Why you're interested in images, in affect and emotions. You talk a little bit in the introduction to your book about that, but we're keen to hear more, just for us to get a sense of what drove your passion for that topic and what produced this wonderful book.
All right. Yeah, okay. Again, thank you very much for having me here, and hello to everyone. So actually, my first, as I like to say, my first encounter with Timor-Leste was when I was an undergrad. So we had, uh, at that time, we had a module on conflict resolution or something like that. And we watched
So that
a
was in
documentary.
Brazil.
Sorry?
That was in Brazil.
Oh yeah, that was in Brazil. Yeah, when we had like this conflict module, and it was about peace, conflict resolution, peace operations, and we had one class about Timor-Leste, and we watched the documentary East Timor Betrayal and Resurrection, which was one of the documentaries that was made with the images of the Santa Cruz massacre, and I will talk about that later. But yeah, and we watched that documentary, and we were a class of undergrads, and that generated a lot of emotions in the room, and people were. We had all sorts of reactions. Some people were shocked by the images, some people were crying, some people had to go out and have some time to recompose themselves. And that kind of dynamic, that atmosphere that the documentary generated called my attention in terms of how those images were able to cause all that, different kinds of reactions. For other people, it doesn't really, caused a lot. They just saw it and, that was it. So that kind of different aspects of how the images affected people really caught my attention. And before that, I've never heard of Timor-Leste, to be honest. And that also really shocked me in terms of, oh my God, all this happened and I didn't, we didn't know it before. Many of my colleagues didn't have no idea that this happened in the 90s in Timor-Leste. So, well, I got home and started researching and, getting to know things about it. And then one thing led to another, and I got a research fellowship back then to work with my dance supervisor. And the project was about East Timor. He had some experience in working with Timor-Leste, and then what, as I said, one thing led to another. My final dissertation for the undergrad was about the peace operations in Timor-Leste and civil society participation. And that particular aspect of the images kind of, stayed on the background a little bit. And for the dissertation, I focused on civil society and the peace operations. And as I said, once again, one thing led to another. I went to my master's and I continued discussing Timor-Leste, but then I focused on language choices after the restoration of independence in 2002. And then, but that but my masters were focused on the choice of language and how that was operating in a sort of politics of memory and what to remember, what to forget in terms of language, in terms of the past. I mean, we can talk about that later, but then, yeah. So when I had to, go to when I chose to go to the PhD, it was like, okay, now maybe it's time to go back to the first encounter and trying to actually talk about the images and talk about that particular effect and that particular atmosphere that, firstly called my attention. So
You already brought up a lot of topics that I'm keen to unwrap together with you, but maybe we can suspend that for a minute. I want to sort of ask you first a more generic question. This book has emerged out of your PhD thesis. You spent several years after your PhD at the University of Manchester in 2002 working on this book. And I was lucky to be, for transparency, Marcel's PhD examiner. So I've seen an earlier version. I've seen the PhD version of the book, and it's fantastic to see how he sort of transformed it into a book. But I was wondering if you can tell us here. There's quite a few people, PhD scholars, early career scholars, who are trying to do the same, publish their thesis as a book. Can you tell us a little bit how you went about it? What your experience was? How did you contact publishers? What were the main challenges? How much rewriting did you do? How did you experience that process? And what are some of your recommendations for our colleagues here who might be doing something similar? And
well, I think the first thing to say is that before finishing the PhD and the writing and talking about the writing style, we had a conversation, like me and my supervisors, we had a conversation in what we wanted and what we were envisioning after. And I already kind of wrote the thesis on a book-like style, so I didn't have to make a lots of changes in the end. So it was sort of, already there. But of course, I mean, I didn't change the content a lot, mostly in terms of maybe changing some of the final chapters, and some of the final chapters were, included in other parts of the book. But in terms of content, I didn't change much. The main thing was to change a little bit of the, of course, it was still a thesis. So most of the language, the signposting, and the kind of structure had to change. So to make it flow a little bit better for a wider public, for a wider audience. So yeah, explaining some concepts or even taking it out at all, and making the text flow and making it more accessible. But for me, I mean, immediately after we finished the Viva, I was already writing the project because, well, and that also leads us to another discussion, because I had a student visa, and then I had to change for a graduate visa here in the UK. And I knew by then that I would have only 3 years to sort things out. So given the amount of time that, academic work takes and, review processes and all of this, I immediately started to write the project. And I also had a conversation with my supervisors, and we selected a few publications. I sent it to maybe 3, and then I got a response from Rowham and Littlefield. Now it's Bloomsbury, but and then I got a response from them. And the process itself, I mean, after the contract was signed, was pretty straightforward, pretty smooth. But the main thing was, getting out of the PhD and, taking a little bit of time to process everything and then already start like the book. I didn't have much time to actually process, everything. I had to do that after. But in terms of writing, I didn't have to change much. But mainly the structure of like a thesis and, signposting and all these concepts. But yeah, I think the most important thing is to have a conversation with your supervisor and, set things, have this conversation before so you don't get, caught up in a lot of work after that. So.
Well, you've done very well with that. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Can you perhaps, I tried to give a bit of a summary of the book when I introduced you, but you can do that much better. Maybe you can do in your own words, give us a bit of a synopsis of what you think the main contribution of the book is, the main objective, but the main contributions before we go into some of the details.
Yeah, so the central argument of the book is that images of suffering bodies can shape political responses by generating what I call affective imageries. And these imageries can influence how conflicts become visible, become understood, and acted upon in international politics, generally speaking. And I think another main argument of the book, another argument is, and I probably will go into the next question, which is how I moved from wounded bodies to bodies in suffering. So as I said, in the book, I move from calling these bodies wounded bodies, and I introduce the concept of bodies in suffering. The problem with the idea of wounded bodies is that it focuses mainly on visible injury. And when I started the PhD, my focus was on the images of the massacre. And maybe now it's time, maybe I can share my screen and show you a few pictures. Can you see?
Yep, we can see the screen, yep.
Okay, so yeah, so I started I started the PhD with the Santa Cruz massacre in mind. So the Santa Cruz massacre happened in 1991. It was first and foremost like a peaceful manifestation against the Indonesian government in East Timor, and it was manifested. It was a protest. Speaking, it was a protest organized by students mainly, and it was pretty much peaceful. They went to the cemetery, the Santa Cruz Cemetery in the capital, Dili, and started protesting. So it was pretty much a peaceful protest. And then the Indonesian military invaded the cemetery and started, shooting everyone. The main thing about the Santa Cruz massacre is that there were international journalists there already covering and making recordings of the protest, and they stayed there when the military invaded. They stayed there. They continued recording, and the images of one journalist, specifically Max Stoll, he was there. He was recording the protests. He continued recording the massacre, and he was able to smuggle the tape. And bring the tape to the UK. And the images were broadcasted in live TV. And that was the point when the so-called international community and everybody else was actually aware, and they were actually seeing what was happening in East Timor, and all the international movements and all the international organizations engagements started more effectively after that. So when I started, going back to the question, so when I started, I had the images of the massacre in mind. As I told you in the beginning, I saw the documentary during my undergrad class, and that was mainly the images that we saw, the images of the massacre and the recordings from Max Stahl. So I had that in mind. That was the main focus. So these injured bodies, how these images of bodies dismembered or wounded, or these visible wounds that shock us. And I mean, now, we have very pretty easy access to everything that is happening in the world, right? So I mean, that's even more shocking in that sense. So the images of the massacre were the main thing for me at that point. But when I moved on to, so these are some other images of the massacre. But when I moved on to,
Can I quickly ask you that they appeared in all major international news outlets at the time, the images that you're displaying?
Yeah. So when they were broadcasted in the UK in live TV, then it was all around. They used it in all sorts of campaign materials. Yeah. And also for international organizations, and also for solidarity movements, civil society solidarity movements that were mainly in Australia, Portugal, Brazil, but mostly in Canada. So civil society movements that also used a lot of these images. But as I moved on to the research, and then probably the COVID question will come here, because so in the beginning, the plan was to go to Timor-Leste, do some interviews, visit the museums, visit memorial sites and etc., and talk to people. Also go to the UN, talk to people, and focus on how the decision-making process was changed, how looking at those images changed people's understanding of the massacre, of the genocide that was happening. But then COVID happened and I couldn't go to Timor-Leste. And then I had to change my whole plan, and I can talk about that in details later, but I had to change everything. So when I changed, I had to change all the methodology, and as a consequence, I think all the kind of the objectives of the project also changed. The materials changed. The way I engaged with the thesis changed, and I started looking at the images themselves, like photographs, movies, documentaries, artwork, all sorts of things. So when I started looking at it, I got to the poems, and I can also talk about the poems in more details later, but I got to the poems of Xanana Guzmão. Xanana wrote this book of poems and paintings while he was in prison. So Xanana was the leader of the independence resistance in East Timor. And I got in contact with the poems, and that changed a lot how I was actually engaging with Timor-Leste in general, but also with my own research my own research interests. So the poems gave me like another perspective on how those bodies were affecting people. The affective power of the poems were different from the photographs, but at the same time, they were part of like a whole system of visibility, right? So
Can I quickly come in? Like one of the interesting things of your book is that you sort of portray the poems not so much in the context of interaction between text and images, but you portray them as sort of images themselves.
Yeah.
So can you probably elaborate why you don't look at them just as text, but actually as other forms of visual or of images that have circulated?
So one of the main, I think one of the main contributions of the book is to talk about how text or how poems or how written material can also construct imageries, or what I call imageries. So when we read the poems and Shanana says like where people are born to for hope in terms of pain, in terms of flesh, in terms of blood, it all creates a sort of image in our minds. And that images are not alone, of course. I mean, they are constituted and they are together with the images of the Santa Cruz massacre, the visual images that it's already in our heads, right? It's already in our background. So these images also create some kind of imagery. Another poem, so this one, I think it's um one of the poems that really shocked me and really caught my attention, because when you read, it's like Shanana is like a film director, and he's kind of, pointing your attention to a different settings, and in the end he constructs like a scene, and it's almost that it's almost that you're there, right? So in the end, this particular this particular poem is so as you read, you start to form the image in your head and to form the whole scene. And in the end of the day, you actually realize that he's talking about like a scene of rape. And that kind of, and that construction is, it's, he writes in a way that it's building up, the scene is building up. So it's very, I mean, this particular poem is very shocking, and it's very, at least for me, it's very effective in the way that he writes it. So it constitutes a scene. It creates this imagery of it is imaginary of how things happen, things that only he saw during his fight. So that's another thing about the poems, how they create this imagery. So, but going back to the other question, I also got in contact with the photographs of Elaine Briere. So Elaine is a photographer. Is a photographer. She was backpacking in Southeast Asia just before the Indonesian invasion, and she took some photographs of people's daily life in some of the communities in Timor-Leste. And at some point during the when in the 90s, when the internet started to become a thing, the civil society movements around the world started to connect, and they started to communicate, and they needed some kind of visual material to construct their campaigns, to use this sort of like visual materials to print pamphlets and all this kind of things. But they didn't have any kind of materials, like visual materials from Timor-Leste at that point. The only person who had like high definition images of Timor-Leste was Elaine at that point. So I think at that point, Elaine had a contact with, I think she knew, I forgot his name. Well, she knew one of the persons who were involved in the Timor-Leste campaign, and they asked her to send the pictures, and she sent it. But as I said, the images were about people living their lives nothing really about the invasion. Actually, the pictures were taken before the invasion. I mean, days before, but even so, it was not about violence, explicit violence. And they were used by the solidarity campaigns in these materials, like this one. So this one is the girl carrying corn. And it was one of the iconic images of the Timor-Leste genocide. So,
Well, why don't we sort of take a pause
sorry.
here, and I'm keen to get people in so that they can ask
Oh, sorry.
questions
Yeah, I
about your
just
book.
kept
That
going
would be
on.
good. Yeah, that's because we've got meanwhile quite a few people online. We have people in the room, so I wanted to see if and people with expertise on Timor-Leste